Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our favorite co-host.
The only co-host. How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing fine, and good to see you here. And we have a couple of things we want to talk about today, but generally, I want to deal with the issue of diplomacy. You know, I used to say in the campaign, we have these, I forget how many, 800 or 2,000 diplomats. Why don't we use them once in a while when all they were doing was, you know, sanctions and warmongering and the Iraqi war was going on in Afghanistan and all. So I don't think we use our diplomats very well. So this is the challenge because there is a bit of diplomacy supposedly going on between the United States, our government, the Trump administration, and Kim in North Korea. And we've praised this. We think that's good. That's a good idea. But it looked like it got a little rocky over the weekend. You know, Pompeo went over and talked to Kim, and then we get two different stories. Pompeo says, hey, it's great, nice guy. No, he didn't say that, but we get along good. There was no problem whatsoever. There was no shouting. It was a good, fun conversation. And what did Kim say? He said it was terrible. The United States acted like gangsters. So, and we're supposed to tell the truth. But actually, we have to search for the truth right now because maybe there's a little bit of truth on both sides because I think we throw our weight around too much, and for foreign governments, I think we could come across as rather gangsterish, you know, like a gangster, you know. At the same time, you know, Kim is quite capable of not being exactly the most trustworthy person in the world. But in spite of it all, it's good that they are talking. I thought on this subject, one thing that was pretty neat today, I think it was on anti-war, it was small. It was a small little village. I think it was close to the DMZ. And they said, you know what? We'd feel a lot better if you just get rid of these THAAD missiles, our missiles, you know, to defend against any attack from North Korea. And remember, we've talked about why the new president of South Korea was a good move because he wanted negotiations. I gave him, the South Korean people and the president of South Korea, some credit for putting, you know, reaching out to North Korea. And once again, it was athletic. They came together, and that was successful. So I think that's the real message. I still believe that if you left it up to the people of South Korea and North Korea and got all the politicians out and all the foreigners out, there'd be peace on the peninsula.
You know, it is an interesting thing because Pompeo went there. He's not a diplomat by training in any sense of the word. As you pointed out before the show, he's a neocon by training. You know, that's his style. He's bombastic. We remember him from the House. He was bombastic in the House. He went on to head the CIA and then went into diplomacy. So he's over there, but he has sort of a unique kind of obligation because he's representing his boss, the president, who's personally invested in the success of these negotiations. So the idea that he came over there and was gangster-like is what they said, made gangster-like demands, could be, as you say, true and slightly not true at the same time. It could be a matter of perception. The U.S. style can tend to be more forceful and forthright. That may not comport very well with the Asian style negotiations. So it may be a cultural, cultural difference. I remember when I was in your office, I took a staff trip to China, and we had a briefing on how the differences in cultures and the differences in how you relate to your Chinese counterparts. And so maybe there's some of that in there as well.
Yes, and you know, the issue also is the tone and how this comes about. And you know, one American diplomat, I don't know who actually said this, maybe a couple, they said, well, what we need to do is follow the Libyan example, which was a bad code war. If they wanted to even pretend they were doing some negotiating with North Korea, what do you mean? You killed Gaddafi and took over the country and destroyed the country, and it's still a mess. And that's the model that you want to follow. But Pompeo, I believe, came up with the thought, no, we want to use the Vietnam model. Oh, holy man. Well, in a way, there's a little bit of goodness. I've said so many times that in the years of peace that existed when we left Vietnam, a lot more was accomplished in peace in 20 years of the French and the Americans fighting and killing the Vietnamese and telling them how to live. So there's something to this. But the big difference I see is, yes, we did better with Vietnam, not the day the war stopped, but we started talking to them. It evolved and generally changed. We started trading and traveling and all these things. But guess what the big event was? We lost. We were defeated because we had bad policy, lost too many Americans. The American people turned against the war, and we got out of there. So good. Pompeo, why don't you consider, follow through, use the Vietnam example, and just get out of Korea. And you don't even have to run with your tail between your legs because, you know, well, you could say, yeah, we accomplished a thing, they haven't attacked, but it's time to do it. Let's leave and see what happens. But I don't think he has that in his mind to do.
Yeah, hopefully it's a post-1975 Vietnam model rather than 1963 Vietnam model. But you know, the North Korean government, here's the quote they had when Pompeo left: "We were expecting the U.S. to come up with constructive measures to help build confidence in the spirit of reunion and talks. However, the attitude of the U.S. was indeed regrettable." And really at stake here is a very delicate thing. It's the issue of denuclearization versus the reduction of sanctions, the elimination of sanctions against North Korea. What comes first? And apparently, according to press reporting, the U.S. is demanding a full denuclearization before any sanctions relief. And of course, that would be anyone with any sense, that would be a dead letter. Forget that. We're not going to do that. It has to go in increments. It has to go in steps. There has to be gestures. And there have been, to Trump's credit and to Kim's credit, there have been small gestures on both sides, building some confidence, building steps. You know, we both read Peter Van Buren's piece that he wrote a few days ago about, and he's a career diplomat, about how diplomacy goes. You don't sit there and bang on the table and say, you do this and we win and run home. It stops and starts and ups and downs.
I thought he had some great advice there. You talk to people and you just let the door open and you go on to and maybe it takes years to do it, but at least you're talking and you're not fighting and threatening. But I do believe that the removal of sanctions would be a big move on our part if we're serious. You know, I think the sanctions should be removed, but I don't think our side is even considering that. I think maybe Pompeo was pretty tough because Abe from Japan, he was very pleased with it, so he wants a tough stand. Unfortunately, we don't know for sure, but I'm not overly optimistic that all of a sudden we're going to go in the direction of real diplomacy and working things out. Of course, one of the tools that I've advocated for many years, and we've seen it work, and we're seeing it almost, I've already mentioned it, and that is the use of sporting events. You know, the whole thing is they got together with the Olympics, and that is great diplomacy, and was in many ways used with China. That was a more diplomatic tool than threatening intimidation. There wasn't walking in and the solution was there. It took years to work it out where the trade's going. Now we're a little bit nervous because we've sort of converted this ruthless communism to, crony capitalism. And I'm afraid they're outdoing us on some issues. Now that we have to become more aggressive with China, which is unnecessary. If we had a true free market economy, we wouldn't have to intimidate anybody else. Absolutely.
You know, Trump is playing a balancing act, I think, when it comes to North Korea, because if you look at, first of all, the media, his Democratic opposition, both of these two are pretty much in lockstep, you'd have to say, with very few exceptions. But if you remember when he was rattling the saber, screaming about little Kim, we're going to take you down, the media was attacking him. How dare he be? And then when he went over there and talked to him and said, hey, we're going to make peace, the media attacked him. You gave away the shop. You know, what are you doing? What do you think you're doing? So he has to deal with that, and that's a real thing that he has to deal with. His Democratic opposition, which no matter what he does, they're going to criticize, on both sides of the issue. He also has to worry a bit, I think, about his Republican base, because I think they view diplomacy as a sign of weakness rather than a sign of strength. And that's our struggle. What we do all the time is trying to convey the idea that diplomacy and peace will make us stronger rather than war, which drains our economy.
Yeah, and I've had a struggle on reconciling Trump, some of the good things he said, and some of the moves he's made, at the same time his appointments. is a total contradiction. So he's saying things and moving in a direction which is favorable with North Korea, but then he sends Pompeo and Bolton over there to settle all this. And I suggested to you earlier that well, maybe you know, it's a game he plays where he's the good cop and gets credit for being open-minded, and he's open for peace and all this. But in the same sense, the guys he hires, they're over there doing this mischief. But I think you suggested the fact that maybe he's dug a hole for himself. That makes it more difficult for him to walk away if he sounded like a peacemaker, then all of a sudden say, oh, okay, my guys figured it out and we have to be real tough, and this whole thing is broken down. It's all North Korea's fault.
Yeah, it's going to be tough for him to walk away now from that. But I think it's also, there's a little bit of humor. Maybe Trump sees this humor in sending someone like Pompeo and Bolton, who every fiber of their being wants to be warlike toward North Korea, saying, now you go over there and negotiate this peace. Part of me wants to think that that's sort of Trump, you know, just playing with people.
Yeah, and he has done that before, and he switches gears rather quickly too.
And now the other thing we want to talk about is the NATO summit, which is this
right.
week, and that is a big one too. And we put these two together because we're looking at, are we looking at the outbreak of diplomacy across a broad front, or is this some sort of a deception? Is it not really? And, you know, Trump has made some plenty of sounds about NATO that we like. Here's a quote just recently. It was from an article in the National Interest. Here's Trump saying, Europe is prosperous and it treats America like a patsy. Let it stand up on its own.
Yeah, and you know, there's going to be the meeting come up in July 11th and 12th, and we will be there, and they're going to enjoy the benefits of a new headquarters and a new media center, which we probably paid for.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So I don't think NATO is going anywhere. If they're building new buildings in Brussels, that they're going to be involved for a while yet. But I think that yeah, Trump makes some good statements. You know, one time he said, get out. He was never serious about that. But that's a throwing a bone to people like us who would like to get out and no need for it. If Robert Taft opposed getting into it way back after World War II, this would be not a big deal to get out. Well, what is second best? Well, quit being a patsy and paying all the bills. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think all it means is a strategy for Trump. I think Trump is very much of an internationalist. He's not a non-interventionist, and he'll want to maintain control as long as he can direct NATO. This is just my opinion. That he's going to be happy, and as long as he gets cover, maybe he will pick up a couple bucks. And at least he sends out the message to a lot of people who are skeptical on NATO and sick and tired of paying all these bills. So he can come out, you know, looking pretty good on this. But I just wished he would reverse this whole thing of the dependency on the use of NATO to justify some of our wars that are going on. And certainly Obama really believed in it strongly, and the hawkish Republicans do. It gives them cover. Oh, we have a NATO. We have a NATO agreement. I remember Bush when he was going into the first Persian Gulf War. I have this mandate from the United Nations. I don't need a vote from the Congress. I mean, that's how they get. So anything that knocks down these international organizations, which are really war organizations, they get together and you get them established. Oh, NATO's behind this. NATO says stop this. United Nations, they just passed a resolution. And I don't think that's the road to peace. We've been fighting a lot of little wars, maybe none real big, but there's been a lot of costly and a lot of devastating wars. Of course, when I say little wars, not as devastating, probably when you think of, you know, tens of thousands like World War I or World War II. But we lost 60,000 in Vietnam, and we lost them in Korea, and it's still a mess. I just don't believe that these international organizations are worth much. And Trump has touched on this, and he knows there's more people than just we who advocate strict non-interventionism. There's a lot of good conservative constitutionalists that realize that we shouldn't do this because it's dangerous, it costs money, and the Constitution doesn't permit it. Right now there's this major talk about authority to use military force going through the Congress. This is something I want to spend more time talking about that, because that is a big issue. It looks like if that passes, that it's going to be authority to go to war anytime, any place, with even less oversight by the Congress.
Yeah, amazing. You know, I was surprised by this article in the National Interest, and I caught it on Zero Hedge. But they really came out critical. Dumped NATO, I think was the title. 70 years later, NATO has failed to be of much use to the U.S. at all. NATO defense budgets don't reflect a real sense of danger from Russia or anyone else. And this goes back to Trump. You know, I think Trump diagnosed the problem correctly. These guys are not paying their fair share. They're sitting back and relying on the U.S. But I think he misses the point on why. It's not because they're freeloaders. It's not because, hey, let the U.S. take care of it. I think it's something very different. And we've discussed this before. This is nothing new. It's because Europe does not sense a real threat to Russia. It's simply a propaganda ploy to bump up the military-industrial complex on both sides of the Atlantic. If they really felt threatened, you wouldn't have to twist their arm to build a couple of tanks.
No, I think that's a good assessment and reason why people shouldn't believe that Russia's going to move the tanks over there. But one other thing that they ignore, though, even though it's getting a lot louder debate, and that is the civil chaos that's coming. I don't believe there's going to be invasions of armies into Europe. I don't think that's going to happen. But there's going to be a lot of strife. I just think that we're only seeing the beginning of what's happening because of this mass migration, which is a consequence of a lot that we do. We say, well, we're totally innocent. No, we're not innocent about what went on in the Middle East. Yeah. And even though it is described as being a major, major crisis in this country, and it is a significant crisis, but it's nothing what is in Europe. But I think the civil strife is going to be internal, and there's going to be civil strife. There's going to be the breakdown of the EU. That's what I believe. It's going to break down. And right now, you know, what's going on in the British Empire right now is more disintegration, and it's over the migration issue.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you know, I would just, I guess, close out because we're getting out of time here, and just point out that as NATO becomes less of a military alliance, we talked about how it's a complete failure. Every war, it's, thanks a lot, gotten involved with us, it's lost. So it's less of a military alliance, but it's more a propaganda alliance. If you look at what NATO's doing, it's not doing a lot of war stuff, it's doing a lot of propaganda. It's funding things like the Atlantic Council, which we've talked about. It's funding things like the German Marshall Fund and other places that are pure pro-war propaganda. They're funded by us to propagandize us. They want to talk about Russia threat 24/7. And in fact, there was a recent publication by an Atlantic Council affiliated group explicitly attacking the Ron Paul Institute for spreading Russian propaganda because we're not in favor of war with Russia. So they are really ginning up on war propaganda. If you look at their literature in advance of this meeting, they're talking about more war propaganda. So what is our response? Our response is going to be on August 18th when we have our conference in Washington, D.C. on media and war. And trust me, we are going to do a lot of talking about the Atlantic Council. We're going to talk a lot about how this money goes from you through NATO into these propaganda outlets to propagandize you to give more money, and around it goes. And we have on the screen how you can get your tickets. You can still get discounted tickets. They're still available. ronpaulinstitute.org/conference. Dr. Paul, these issues are critical.
Very good, and thank you, Daniel. And I want to just express my appreciation to our viewing audience, not only for joining us in this program, but also supporting us elsewhere with our conferences as all. But I just want to close with making the point that you know, there's a lot that we can do and should do in movement away from this confrontation. And the big problem is that if you do that, you're considered wimpish and not strong and not tough. But I've always been convinced in my own mind that you can be strong and influential in a quiet sort of way, that you don't have to threaten people, put on sanctions, threaten military operations, and that only makes things that much worse. So I think that we're capable of doing something, but it involves changing an attitude, and the attitude is that we shouldn't have an empire. we shouldn't be telling other people how to live, even if we think that we do a lot better. Forcing them to try to live the way we do isn't going to work. But the problem is we have less to spread. Our message is not as strong as it was, 100 years ago about the American system and what freedom is all about and free markets, because we have a mess. I saw an article today that claimed that we're a third world nation. I think that might be going a little bit too far, but you could be convinced that if you go to the inner cities. Matter of fact, maybe all you have to do is go to the streets of San Francisco, and you might think, hey, what's happening to this country? So I think it's ideological, and it's a belief in freedom. It's a belief in non-intervention and individual liberty, and all this mischief of telling people how to live and what to do. It leads to internal conflict, because once people believe they can tell other people how to live, they fight over who the boss is, and that's what's happening in this country and around the world, because everybody believes in intervention, telling other people what to do, and they're only vying for who is the boss and who controls it and who controls the money. But liberty offers a different solution to that, and that is the respect for other people and allowing people to live their lives as long as they don't hurt other people. It's a philosophy of tolerance and one of peace. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and please come back to the Liberty Report soon.